Hey guys, tonight we are heading somewhere cold, quiet, and ink-stained. You're standing in a windswept Icelandic valley, somewhere around the 12th century, where the air smells faintly of wet moss and sheep wool, and the only sound is the distant rush of a glacial river. There's a small turf-roofed church on the horizon, its walls dark with age and soot. Inside, a man bends over a piece of stretched calfskin, quill in hand, squinting through candle smoke. He's not a monk exactly, not a farmer either. He's something in between. A scribe, the earliest of Iceland's quiet historians. You probably wouldn't last 10 minutes here. The ink freezes, the candles sputter, and your fingers would go numb before you could even spell your name. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, post your location and the local time down in the comments. I love seeing where and when you all listen from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through wet grass, boots sinking into the spongy ground. The air is sharp, like it's been filtered through ice. The valley feels endless, but the houses are few, low, turf-covered things that seem to grow out of the land itself. Inside one, the scent of mutton stew mingles with the bitter tang of iron gall ink. You can hear the scratch of a quill before you even open the door. Writing has only just arrived here. It's new, strange, and precious. Historians still argue whether the first Icelandic scribes were trained abroad, perhaps in England or Norway, or whether they taught themselves after seeing imported books. Either way, the written word feels almost magical. In a land where daylight disappears for months, the act of capturing words feels like bottling sunlight. You lean over the shoulder of one of these early scribes, a man with windburned cheeks, his hair matted with smoke. His name could be something like BJ Jern or Einar, names that taste of salt and cold air. He dips his quill into ink made from soot and fish oil, and carefully traces letters that look both Roman and rune-like. He murmurs the words as he writes, shaping them with his breath. It's the only warmth in the room. The ink smells odd, half burnt, half sour, and the parchment beneath his hand is not paper at all, but the scraped, sanded hide of a calf. Every sheet is a tiny fortune. A single saga might require the skins of a whole herd. You realize how absurdly valuable stories are here. If you mess up, there's no backspace key, just a long sigh, and the sting of wasted vellum. A second man sits nearby, sharpening quills on a whetstone. He glances at you, probably assuming you're another apprentice. You nod politely, pretending you belong here. The candle flickers, casting shadows that dance across the manuscript. Outside, wind claws at the wooden shutters. The scribe doesn't look up. His whole world is in those lines of ink. Family histories, shipwreck tales, feuds that lasted generations. You wonder if he knows he's creating something that will outlive him by centuries. In those early days, writing wasn't a casual act. It was ceremony. The very first Icelandic scribes copied legal codes, prayers, and genealogies. The Icelandic law, Sagas, was among the first major works written down. But before that, it had been memorized word for word, recited by sögumenn, or law speakers, who could recall entire codes by heart. Imagine trying to memorize your local tax laws just to keep society functioning. You'd probably fall asleep halfway through. Which, to be fair, is exactly what we're aiming for tonight. Still, that's the miracle of it. Icelandic literacy didn't begin in monasteries, as in most of Europe, but in homes and farmsteads. These weren't cloistered monks behind stone walls. They were everyday people, sheep herders by day, historians by lamplight. It's as if your neighbor who fixes tractors by day also spends the night hand-copying the Odyssey in cursive. A quirky little fact: because vellum was so scarce, scribes often reused older manuscripts. They'd scrape away old ink and write something new on the same skin. A practice called palimpsest. Some scholars today use infrared light to read what was once erased. Bits of forgotten poetry, grocery lists, even small doodles of ships and birds. It's like discovering medieval text messages hidden beneath official documents. And there's something oddly soothing about the rhythm of it all. You can hear the quill scratching, the fire hissing, the slow exhale every time a line is finished. Outside, snow begins to fall. The flakes drift sideways in the wind, soft as ash. Inside, words are quietly being born, but it wasn't all solemn devotion. Icelanders, even then, had a sense of humor drier than driftwood. Margins of manuscripts from later centuries include casual comments like, "I'm so cold, I can barely write this," or "The ink is bad, the light is worse, pray for me." You can almost hear the weary chuckle behind each line. The act of writing in Iceland wasn't just an intellectual pursuit, it was survival by storytelling. And yet, as you watch this first generation of scribes at work, you can feel how fragile their world is. The ink freezes, the vellum cracks, the lamps smoke. Every page is a battle against the elements, and still, they persist, because if they don't, their stories about gods, kings, farmers, and storms will vanish like breath in the cold. Outside, a raven lands on the roof. The scribe pauses, looks up, and mutters something about Odin's messengers. You can't tell if he's joking or not. Maybe a bit of both. In a place where myth and reality overlap, that line doesn't really matter. You sit back, feeling the faint warmth of the fire on your face. The valley hums with silence, the kind that seeps into your bones. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog barks once, and then curls back to sleep. The scribe dips his quill again, and the sound of scratching continues, steady and hypnotic. It's strange to think this moment, just a tired man writing in a cold house, marks the beginning of one of Europe's richest literary traditions. Iceland, a tiny island with barely 60,000 people in medieval times, would go on to preserve more sagas, myths, and genealogies than almost any other culture of its size. You close your eyes for a moment, listening. The ink glides, the wind sighs, and history begins to take shape under trembling fingers. The first Icelandic scribes are writing themselves into eternity, even if they don't know it yet. You wake up, or maybe you never quite fell asleep, in the same valley, and the air smells different now. There's something sharper in it, animal and mineral all at once. You follow the scent to a small hut near a stream, where two men are scraping wet skins across a wooden frame. The sound is steady, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Sheep bleat faintly in the distance. This, it turns out, is what the making of Icelandic parchment sounds like. A soft rasp of steel on hide, a ghostly hiss in the cold air. The men pause, wipe their hands on their wool tunics, and glance up at you. One nods toward a bucket of lime water beside the door. Inside, more hide soak, their pale surfaces bubbling faintly. The smell is, how to put this politely, memorable. Like yogurt and seaweed had a complicated argument. But this is how every Icelandic manuscript begins. Not with ink, not with words, but with a smell that never really leaves your clothes. You step closer and run your hand gently over the parchment. It's smooth but tense, like it's still remembering what it used to be. This is sheep country after all. You realize that almost every page of medieval Icelandic history, every saga, every sermon, was once a flock grazing on a windy hillside. It's a strange kind of recycling, though an eco-conscious monk might call it poetic. One of the men points to a rack where stretched hides dry in the thin sunlight. Each one is translucent, trembling slightly in the breeze. They'll be scraped again and again, sometimes with shards of pumice stone brought by trade ships from far-off Sicily. The process could take days, and when it's done, a sheet of vellum becomes more valuable than silver. Historians still argue whether Iceland imported its earliest parchment-making techniques from Ireland or from the Benedictine houses in Norway. The styles overlap. Norse sheets were thicker and more durable, while Irish vellum tended to be thinner with a creamier hue. Iceland, being Iceland, probably just borrowed both and made it work with whatever materials were available. Which is to say, sheep. You sit nearby and watch as one of them begins mixing chalk powder with animal fat to smooth the surface. His movements are almost meditative, and the repetition becomes hypnotic. You imagine dozens of people across the island doing the same thing, scraping, rubbing, waiting. The whole country quietly preparing its own memory. Now the scribes arrive. Their fingers are rough from cold and salt, but when they handle the finished vellum, it's like watching someone hold a newborn. They bend close to inspect the grain of each sheet. One smiles faintly and mutters something about the good side, meaning the skin's smoother surface. You can tell this is not just material, it's identity. There's a reason Icelandic manuscripts have lasted centuries in relatively good condition. The cold, dry air helped, of course, but so did the care that went into every page. Each skin was stretched with ropes, dried slowly, trimmed precisely to standard sizes. Some were even reused from older legal documents, so you might find a saint's life faintly visible under a line about sheep taxes. A fringe tidbit here. Medieval Icelanders sometimes rubbed their vellum with powdered bones to whiten it further. Occasionally, archaeologists have identified traces of whalebone dust in manuscripts. It's oddly fitting. One ocean giant helping preserve the tales of human giants. You move inside the workshop now, where the air is warmer and carries a sweet, burnt scent. Ink-making day. A pot simmers over a small hearth, its contents thick and black. Someone stirs it with a stick, muttering about soot quality. The ingredients are local and entirely unappetizing. Lamb-black from burnt driftwood, iron salts from bog ore, and a dash of ale to thin it. If you've ever wondered what history smells like, the answer is probably somewhere between stale beer and campfire. They test the ink by drawing lines on scraps of vellum. Too thick, and it flakes. Too thin, and it bleeds. The right mixture makes a line that gleams blue under candlelight. You watch as one of them adds a few drops of vinegar, complaining that the last batch froze solid before it could be used. Icelandic winters don't care about your artistic process, but they keep at it. You can sense that mixture of patience and stubbornness that defines every corner of Icelandic history. A people who made books in the dark and fish in the light, both equally essential. Historians still debate how early Icelanders began exporting manuscripts, or whether they even considered them trade goods. Some say vellum sheets traveled as far as Bergen or Dublin. Others think Icelandic scribes hoarded them jealously, like secret gold. Judging by the way these men watch their drying hides, you'd guess the latter. The day lengthens. The smell of lime fades a bit, replaced by smoke from peat fires. A boy runs in, cheeks red, carrying a small wooden box. Inside are quills, some imported goose feathers, others hand-cut from local swans. The master scribe takes one, flexes it, and tests the nib against his thumbnail. Satisfied, he nods. Another small miracle in the making. You imagine this process repeated across generations. The tools hardly change, yet the stories written on these sheets will shift from Norse gods to Christian saints, from heroic blood feuds to lists of grain taxes. Parchment doesn't care what it holds. It only endures. You lean back, and for a moment, the rhythmic sounds of scraping and stirring blur into something almost like ocean waves. The craft itself feels eternal, cyclical, each generation quite literally riding upon the bones of the last. As night falls, the workshop glows faintly through the turf roof, little squares of golden light against the snow. Inside, someone hums a slow tune, half lullaby, half prayer. Maybe it's just a way to keep time, or maybe it's gratitude that the ink has finally stopped freezing. A soft joke rises from the corner. If I die smelling like lime and sheep, bury me with the good parchment. The others laugh quietly. Humor, even here, cuts through the cold better than fire. Outside, the stars prick through the twilight. Sharp, clear, indifferent. Somewhere in the dark, another scribe lights his lamp. Another calfskin dries, and you realize this entire island is slowly covering itself in words, one scraped hide at a time. Morning again, though in an Icelandic sense, morning just means the light is slightly less gray. You're still in the valley, but now the workshop smells of ink instead of lime. The scribes are gone. Their benches are empty, except for a few stray quills and an unfinished page stretched taut across a wooden frame. Outside, the wind hums against the eaves. You follow that faint rhythm toward the sound of voices. Down by the church, a group of men sit hunched together, reading aloud from a piece of parchment. The voice of the reader is soft but steady, almost like a lullaby. His accent rolls the words slowly, as if the syllables themselves need warming. This, you realize, is one of the first sagas being written. Icelandic Scribes, perhaps, or the Book of Settlements, the Landnabok. You crouch nearby and listen. The story is simple. Who settled where? Who fought whom? Who claimed which valley? But the rhythm is captivating, hypnotic even. Each sentence feels like it's been tested by fire, cooled, and reshaped by memory before ever meeting the page. For centuries, Icelanders had no writing. Their history lived in their voices, recited by poets called skalds, or by elders who remembered the deeds of ancestors. Words were a shared fire, passed hand to hand. Now, for the first time, those same words are being caught, frozen, tamed on skin. You can sense the hesitation in the room. The scribes know they're doing something dangerous. Once a story is written, it can't change with the telling. It stops breathing, in a way. Historians still argue whether early Icelanders trusted writing at all, or whether they thought it dulled memory, turned living knowledge into something stiff and cold. Some families even forbade their sagas to be written until generations later. But curiosity wins, as it usually does. The scribe's hand trembles as he writes the first line. His quill scratches out the sound of his own language for the first time. The letters are unfamiliar but beautiful. Long, curling shapes borrowed from Latin, but softened by Norse pronunciation. You watch the ink glisten, then dry. The sound of the pen is as quiet as snowfall. The scribe looks up briefly and sighs, the way someone might after lifting a heavy stone. There, he says softly, it's done. Of course, it isn't, because writing has a way of multiplying itself. Once one man sets down words, someone else wants to do the same. By the end of the 12th century, More and more Icelanders were writing laws, sermons, genealogies, and most famously, stories. The Sagas. You might imagine these sagas being dictated by ancient warriors. But in truth, they were mostly written by educated farmers and clerics. People who had to pause mid-sentence to feed sheep or mend fences. A saga might take months, even years to finish. Sometimes a storm destroyed half a manuscript before it was done. You look over a scribe's shoulder and see neat rows of text in black ink. There's no punctuation, no paragraphs, no chapter titles, just a steady river of words. Reading one aloud would sound like chanting, like a steady heartbeat. You try to follow the lines, but get lost among the strange letter shapes. It's okay. You're not really meant to understand it. You're meant to feel it. A quirky detail. Early Icelandic scribes sometimes numbered their lines by scratching tiny dots in the margins, each dot marking a pause or a change in rhythm. Some modern scholars think it was their way of keeping the oral cadence alive, even on the page. You can still trace those faint marks today, like tiny footprints in snow. You shift your weight, and the wooden floor creaks. The reader glances up and smiles. "We tell these stories," he says, "so the dead won't vanish twice." You nod, though you're not sure he expects an answer. As the afternoon darkens, you follow him outside. The air smells faintly of peat smoke and sea salt. He rolls the manuscript carefully, ties it with a leather thong, and places it inside a wooden chest. The chest already holds several others. Each one is a life preserved. One saga, one family, one valley's worth of memory. He looks at the horizon, where the mountains meet the sea, and you can almost hear the next line forming in his head. He'll write it tonight, maybe by a single flickering lamp. And if the ink freezes again, he'll thaw it over the fire and keep going. Historians still debate whether the Icelandic sagas were written from direct memory or adapted from older oral poems. The truth probably lies somewhere between. Part memory, part invention, all filtered through that distinctly Icelandic patience with time. What matters is that once they began writing, they didn't stop. Within 2 centuries, this small, rocky island would produce a literary output rivaling anything in medieval Europe. But for now, the stories are still young. The ink is fresh, the hands are steady, the parchment soft. You can feel the weight of the moment. How fragile it all is. One misplaced ember, one careless sheep hoof, and a whole saga could vanish. And yet, against every practical instinct, they write. Outside, snow begins to fall again, thick and soundless. You tilt your head and catch a flake on your sleeve. It melts instantly. Somewhere behind you, the reader's voice continues, soft and unbroken, filling the valley with ancient names. You smile. This is how history begins, with a few stubborn souls, a pot of ink, and the desire to keep talking even when the wind won't listen. A woman passes by carrying a bundle of driftwood, humming a tune you can't quite place. Maybe it's the same song the scribes hum to themselves when the candles burn low. Maybe it's always been there, echoing between the lines of every story. The light fades to blue, and you realize you've been standing still for a long time, breathing with the rhythm of the scribes. In, out, scratch, pause, word, silence. If you listen closely enough, the quill's movements almost sound like waves on shore, a heartbeat written in ink. The next night begins with the smell of smoke, good smoke. The kind that means someone's brewing something questionable but ingenious. You're in a farmhouse, low-roofed and warm with the scent of ale, soot, and damp wool. A few men huddle around a table, and one of them is stirring a pot so black it seems to swallow the candlelight. You've stumbled into another Icelandic innovation, the art of making ink that refuses to die. The pot bubbles lazily. The mixture inside is part chemistry experiment, part folk magic, soot from burnt birch, crushed iron filings from bog ore, and a generous splash of old ale. One of the men leans over and sniffs the concoction, grimaces and mutters, "Too much beer, not enough soot." The others laugh softly, though one coughs in agreement. This is the world of the Icelandic scribe, half scholar, half survivalist. You dip your head to avoid a smoky beam and watch as they pour the liquid into a small horn cup to cool. It glistens like oil. The man who stirred it, a short fellow with soot-black fingernails, sighs and says, "If it freezes again, I'm using seal fat next time." You hope he's joking. Probably. Historians still argue whether Icelandic scribes borrowed their ink recipes from the English monasteries, or invented them from whatever happened to lie around the hearth. The evidence suggests both. Plenty of experimentation, plenty of failure. In some manuscripts, the ink has faded to brown. In others, it's still black as night after 800 years. You step closer and see him test the ink with a quill on a scrap of vellum. The line shines, then dries matte. Success. He grins and dips again, this time writing a few looping letters that spell out Dios miserere mei, God have mercy on me. You can't tell if that's a prayer or a sigh. There's ale everywhere. Bottles, mugs, puddles. One young assistant is supposed to be filtering soot, but seems more interested in drinking the byproduct. He catches your eye, winks, and whispers, "Ink or ale, same recipe, different goal." You almost choke on your own laugh. They keep stirring long into the night. Outside, snow beats against the shutter. Inside, the fire snaps and smokes. Someone starts telling a story about a cow that wandered into the sea and came back with frost in its horns. No one questions the logic. This is Iceland. Cows do strange things here. As the night grows later, the air becomes heavy with soot, and you can taste the ink in your throat. Still, there's something comforting about the repetition. Dip, stir, pour, test. The rhythm of it feels like breathing for these people. Without ink, the words would vanish, and without words, their world would shrink. When the ink cools, the scribe covers the pot with cloth and moves to his desk. The surface is uneven driftwood polished by years of use. He sits, cracks his knuckles, and breathes on his fingers to warm them. Then, with a kind of reverent slowness, he begins to write. You notice something. He's not copying scripture tonight. He's writing a letter, perhaps to another household or a chieftain. The handwriting is neat, but quick, a little more personal. Maybe he's describing the weather, or asking for payment, or sending greetings for a feast. Whatever it is, he looks content doing it. For a few minutes, his world shrinks to the line between ink and skin. Historians believe many Icelandic scribes also served as community clerks, letter writers, and keepers of legal records. The same hands that copied saints' lives might also record who owed whom a cow, or whose fence needed fixing. Writing wasn't just art, it was infrastructure. A fringe detail survives in some farm accounts. Payments to scribes listed not in silver but in ale, cheese, or even dried fish. Imagine working for cod instead of cash. Though honestly, in Iceland's economy, fish probably spent better than coin. A sudden draft flutters the parchment. The scribe frowns, places a small stone on the corner, and mutters something about spirits in the wind. His companion laughs and says, "Not spirits, just holes in the wall." Humor again, quiet and dry. You realize This is how they survive the long winters. Laughter and ink, and maybe not in that order. They take turns writing, reading, drinking, laughing. At one point, someone quotes a verse about the creation of language, comparing the first word spoken by God to the first word written by man. You don't catch every syllable, but the idea lingers, writing as a kind of second creation, fragile but enduring. Outside, the wind finally dies down. The room feels softer now, the fire glowing low and red. The scribe sets down his quill, flexes his fingers, and smiles in that half-satisfied way of someone who knows tomorrow he'll curse his own handwriting. Historians still debate whether these long nights of writing were acts of devotion or simple routine. Perhaps both. For many scribes, copying texts wasn't only about preserving knowledge. It was a meditative act, a quiet resistance against chaos and silence. The room settles into calm. Someone begins humming, a tune you recognize from earlier nights. Maybe it's the same melody that echoes through every Icelandic saga, a reminder that stories here aren't written once. They're lived over and over. The scribe takes a final sip of ale, leans back, and stares at his work. The ink glimmers faintly in the firelight. Outside, the snow resumes, each flake landing soundlessly, like punctuation marks in a sky-wide story. He exhales, long and slow, as though the air itself could seal the words forever. You close your eyes and listen. The crackle of fire, the faint scratch of quill, the murmur of laughter. Somewhere between the soot and the ale, between silence and speech, Iceland found its voice. Dawn again. Gray, soft, and somehow eternal. You're standing outside a farmhouse that smells faintly of smoke and sheep, where inside you hear something unexpected. Not quills, not scraping hides, but voices. Warm, rhythmic, layered like waves. It's storytelling time, and in Iceland, that's serious business. You duck inside. The room glows amber with lamplight, and around the central fire sits a circle of men, women, and children, each wrapped in wool. One of them, a silver-haired man with a face as creased as the parchment you saw last night, is speaking. His voice flows like slow honey, soft, deliberate, and entirely commanding. He doesn't read from a book. There's no vellum, no ink, no quill. The story lives inside him, whole and breathing. He's telling Jarl Saga, or maybe Eagle Saga. You're not sure which yet, but it's not quite as it appears in the manuscripts. The rhythm is older, more alive, and every line seems to hold the room in stillness. You realize this is how Iceland remembered itself for centuries. By ear, not by eye. A land without trees had little paper or parchment to spare, but memory grew tall here. Icelanders carried their entire histories in their heads. Genealogies, laws, poems, myths, all woven into the sagas that defined who they were. One of the younger listeners interrupts with a grin, correcting a detail about who killed whom in a feud. The old man narrows his eyes, chuckles, and concedes the point. You're right, he says. I forgot he lost an ear first. Laughter ripples through the room. The correction isn't disrespect, it's tradition. Storytelling here is a communal act, and accuracy, oddly enough, lives in the debate. Historians still argue whether Iceland's oral traditions were truly memorized word for word, or whether storytellers freely reshaped them each time. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The stories had bones that stayed the same, but the flesh changed with every telling. Each audience, each night, added its own small edits to history. You settle onto a stool, letting the warmth soak into your legs. The fire hisses as someone tosses in a log. Sparks dance upward, and for a moment, you imagine them as tiny words flying into the air. glowing for a second before fading. The old storyteller pauses, sipping from a wooden cup, then continues. This part of the saga describes a sea voyage. The spray of salt, the creak of oars, the cry of gulls. You can almost taste the ocean. The children lean closer, wide-eyed. One of them mouths along, knowing every word before it's said. You realize that the line between speaker and listener here is almost gone. Everyone shares ownership of the story. It's hard to overstate how strange this is to modern ears. Imagine your entire legal system, history, and entertainment, all preserved by memory and spoken nightly by candlelight. No libraries, no hard drives, just people passing stories mouth to mouth like warm bread. A quirky fact: some early Icelandic storytellers used physical cues, runes carved into small sticks or notches on whalebone, to remind themselves of the story's sequence. Think of them as prehistoric cue cards. Archaeologists have even found a few of these memory bones, buried near old farmsteads, faint marks still visible on their surface. You can picture some long-dead storyteller palming one as he spoke, fingers tracing each line while his voice spun worlds into being. The saga moves on. It turns darker, bloodier, but the tone stays calm. There's no shouting, no dramatics. Icelanders don't embellish their stories with emotion. They let understatement do the work. A man's death might be described with a single line, and that was the end of him. Brutal, yes, but oddly peaceful, too. The night stretches long, the saga longer. Outside, wind presses against the turf walls. Inside, the old man's voice continues steady and low. You find yourself drifting in and out of the rhythm, your heartbeat sensing with his words. Then comes a pause. The storyteller sighs, rubs his eyes, and gestures to a younger man. Your turn, he says. The younger one hesitates, clears his throat, and begins where the elder left off. His delivery is faster, more dramatic, but the bones of the story remain intact. You can sense the shift, a bridge between generations. Historians think this is exactly how the saga survived long enough to be written down centuries later. Each generation retold them, slightly adjusting, polishing, preserving. When writing finally arrived, these oral memories poured onto the page almost ready-made. The manuscripts then aren't pure invention. They're snapshots of a conversation already centuries old. As the night deepens, you glance toward the door. The stars outside look impossibly close, like frost hanging in midair. The fire burns low, and the storyteller's voice softens into a whisper. The saga ends not with a bang, but with a silence that feels earned. He nods once, satisfied, and the room exhales as one. Someone refills cups. Someone else mutters, "That one gets better every winter." You smile. It probably does. Before bed, the scribe from earlier wanders in, his fingers still smudged with ink. He sits quietly in the back, listening, his eyes reflecting the firelight. You know what he's thinking. How to fit these spoken words into lines on vellum without losing their soul. It's not an easy task, capturing a living voice in dead ink. But he'll try. Tomorrow night, he'll take his quill and start tracing these same tales, the same way he traces the cracks in the valley's ice. Slowly, carefully, knowing they'll melt if pressed too hard. Outside, the wind picks up again, but it sounds softer now, almost like applause. The last of the listeners stand, stretch, and vanish into the dark. You linger by the dying fire, surrounded by the scent of peat smoke and the echo of words older than ink. You can feel it already. The shift from memory to manuscript, from air to skin. The island itself seems to lean in, listening to its own story being born. The next evening finds you in a dimly lit room, filled with a quiet kind of tension. The good kind. The sort that hums between concentration and pride. The smell of melted tallow candles mixes with ink and wool. Outside, snowflakes fall slowly, each one a tiny spark against the window's frost. Inside, 3 men sit side by side at a long table, bent over parchment. This is where competition lives. Not the loud, sword-swinging kind, but the slow, silent duel of scribes. Each man has his own quill, his own pot of ink, and his own pile of vellum sheets. They copy from the same manuscript, line by line, word by word. But every letter, every curve of a stroke, becomes a matter of pride. You can almost taste the stubbornness in the air. The first man, whose name might be Oraring, writes in a flowing, almost musical hand. The second prefers rigid, tidy letters, military in precision. Third, well, he's slow but steady. He pauses often to blow on his ink, muttering about righteous spacing. You lean against the wall, amused. If anyone ever told you history was boring, they never watched a group of medieval Icelandic men silently competing over who could make the prettiest dough. There's a saying among scribes, a crooked line, a crooked soul. It's probably meant as a joke, but none of these men are laughing. Every few minutes, one sneaks a glance sideways to check the other's progress. When one lets out the tiniest sigh, perhaps his ink blotched or a line smeared, the others grin just slightly, a flicker of victory in their tired eyes. Historians still argue whether Iceland's monastic scriptoria, places like Hingivir Abbey, encouraged collaboration or rivalry. Surviving manuscripts show both. Some pages copied with uniform, almost mechanical precision. Others full of personality, where each scribe's quirks peek through like fingerprints. Either way, you get the sense that even in this quiet, snow-trapped world, ego found its way to the page. The head scribe, a tall man with silver hair, finally speaks. No mistakes, he says. God and grammar watch alike. Everyone straightens up a little. The quills resume their scratching, steady, synchronized, the soft heartbeat of a manuscript being born. A quirky little tidbit. Some Icelandic scribes left self-portraits in their work, not drawings, but hidden jokes. In the margins of one 14th century text, a tiny line reads, "I am tired and the light is poor." In another, this scribe wrote while hungry. Forgive any nonsense. It's like finding a medieval tweet in the corner of a saint's life. The men write through the afternoon. A pot of ink grows thick. One of them warms it by the fire, muttering that it stiffens faster than a bishop's sermon. The others smirk, but keep working. You notice how deliberate their movements are. Dip, stroke, breathe, lift. Every line is a meditation. Sometimes the rhythm breaks. A quill splinters. A sheet tears. Someone curses softly and begins again. The patience required here is almost supernatural. You start to see why Icelandic culture leaned toward calm endurance. If you can copy the same text for 14 hours straight without hurling your quill into the snow, you can probably survive a volcanic winter. Outside, the light fades to gray. The snow deepens. The scribes begin whispering about whose work will be kept in the good chest. That's the ultimate compliment. A manuscript so finely copied that it earns a place in the community's strongbox, alongside family treasures in silver. Anything less goes into the reading chest, still valuable, but not immortal. Historians believe that certain Icelandic families did in fact keep private libraries, collections of manuscripts stored in wooden boxes lined with wool to keep out damp. A few of those very boxes still exist, now held in museums, their edges polished by generations of careful hands. It's strange to think the pages you're watching being written might one day sit inside one of them, hundreds of years from now, still whispering under glass. You wander closer. One of the scribes pauses and flexes his fingers, cramped from hours of work. "It's not fair," he mutters. "He has better light." The others laugh, and the tension breaks. Someone passes around a jug of ale. The sound of laughter, soft and genuine, fills the room. For a moment, everything slows. The scratching stops. The only sound is the wind pressing against the shutters, and the faint crackle of the fire. You realize this is the closest thing to peace many of them will ever know. A shared silence, ink on their fingers, warmth on their faces, words slowly weaving the island together. The silver-haired scribe finally leans back and inspects a page. "Good," he murmurs, tracing the lines with one rough finger. Then he adds, almost fondly, "Your R still leans like a drunk." The younger scribe blushes, hides his grin, and keeps writing. You notice the subtle pride in his movements now, a quiet defiance. He'll stay up late to perfect that letter, even if no one ever notices. Maybe he'll add a small doodle later, just a sheep in the corner. Nothing grand. Maybe someone centuries from now will see it and smile, not knowing who made it or why. That's the beauty of their rivalry. It's not cruel, not loud, but rooted in care. Every imperfection is a lesson. Every perfect page, a secret triumph. In their hands, language is just communication. It's craft. Historians still debate how much of Iceland's unique saga style, dry, ironic, spare, comes from this scribal culture. Maybe it's a byproduct of long winters and meticulous habits. When you live where ink freezes before it dries, you learn to make every word count. The night grows deeper. The scribes finally stop, stretching stiff shoulders. They lay their quills aside like tiny swords, wash their hands in melted snow, and gather their finished pages into neat stacks. The silver-haired man says a brief prayer, not for divine reward, but for steady hands tomorrow. You step outside with them. The air bites your face, but the stars above are impossibly clear. The men stand in silence, their breath steaming like smoke. Then one says, half to himself, "We write to remember. But we remember better when we write." You smile, because that feels true not just for them, but for everyone who ever tried to hold a moment still. Inside, the fire dies. The last page on the table glows faintly in the candlelight, ink still drying, a single perfect R, leaning stubbornly toward eternity. The wind shifts again, softer now, almost curious, as you make your way toward a low building near the edge of the settlement. It's not a monastery, not exactly, but it smells faintly of tallow, lavender, and beeswax. Inside, you find women writing. The room surprises you at first. You were expecting monks, bearded scholars, or tired farmers. But here, around a sturdy oak table, are 4 women. Sisters perhaps, or cousins, each with a quill in hand and a steady patience that feels older than the mountains outside. They talk quietly as they work, voices like the rustle of parchment itself. These are the women of the quill. They are less mentioned in the records, of course. Historians still argue how many female scribes Iceland had, or whether they mostly copied religious texts or helped with sagas. But the evidence, though faint, lingers in the margins, literally. In some manuscripts, a delicate correction or a single name in feminine form gives them away. And sometimes the handwriting itself. Smaller, more graceful, yet just as confident. One of the women, a middle-aged figure with hair braided and pinned under a linen scarf, catches your eye. She gestures for you to sit, as if it's the most natural thing in the world to invite a stranger to watch her work. Her quill dances across the vellum in small, neat letters. She's copying a song, the ink shimmering wetly. Writing keeps the mind still, she says quietly, not looking up. Even when the world outside is loud. You glance toward the small window. The loud she speaks of could mean the wind, or childbirth, or daily farm labor waiting just beyond the door. Icelandic women, after all, worked as hard as the men. But in rare moments like this, the world narrows to ink, light, and patience. A younger woman beside her hums softly while writing. Her task is different. She's adding illumination. There's no gold leaf here. Too expensive, too impractical. But she uses crushed berries and soot to make reds and purples. The brush is fine, made from horsehair. You watch as she paints a single curling vine around the capital letter D. The stroke is so gentle, it looks like breath. You think of how few people today know their names, yet their hands built part of Iceland's literary legacy. Historians still debate whether noble women like those from the powerful Ardavajar family trained as scribes themselves, or merely oversaw household manuscripts. But one name surfaces again and again in whispers. Olbera, an abbess at Reynistad Cloister in the 14th century, known for her knowledge of law and Latin. Some think she helped preserve parts of the Jonsbok, Iceland's foundational law code. If that's true, her pen didn't just write stories. It shaped justice. The older woman pauses to stretch her fingers. Her knuckles are swollen, but her eyes stay sharp. She leans close to inspect a line she's written, lips moving silently as she checks her Latin. Her breath fogs in the cold air. A young girl enters, barefoot, hair wild from wind. She brings a tray of peat tea and a small wheel of cheese. "Mother says you've forgotten dinner again," she teases. The women laugh softly. "We're feeding the soul tonight," the eldest replies. You can hear affection in her tone, the warmth of a small community surviving the long dark together. A quirky little fact. Some Icelandic households turn their lofts into makeshift scriptoria like this, with small holes drilled in the turf walls to let in slivers of light. They called them skrifhus, writing houses. On clear days, the sun's reflection off snow would illuminate the room just enough for a few hours' work. Imagine writing law codes or poetry by the glow of snowlight. It sounds impossible, yet somehow they managed. The women keep writing as you sip the tea. It's earthy and strange, with a hint of moss. The hum of their voices blends with the scratching of quills. Outside, you hear a faint bleating of sheep. Then the sudden silence that follows when the wind changes direction. The youngest woman sighs. "My brother says this work is too slow for him," she says. The eldest smiles, eyes still on the page. "That's why we'll outlast him." You grin quietly. She's right. The text she's copying now is a genealogy, a long, winding list of names. To an outsider, it might seem dull, but to her, each name is a story, a face, a thread in the vast fabric of her people. The rhythm of the names, Björn, Oran, Hallgrim, Ragnar, becomes like a song. You start to hear the music in it, steady and low. Historians still argue whether these domestic writing spaces were officially sanctioned by the church or quietly tolerated. It's possible that women like these worked under the radar, copying prayers or preserving sagas, while their husbands tended livestock. Iceland was too small, too harsh a place to waste any talent willing to hold a quill. The fire crackles softly. The scent of ink and tallow fills the air. One woman sneezes and curses under her breath. Saints forgive this dust. Another giggles. The laughter feels warm enough to light the room. Hours pass. You lose track of time. The women's movements never rush, never falter. Every letter, every breath seems placed with purpose. And when one finally sets her quill down, she murmurs a blessing over the page. May the words remember us kindly. It hits you in that quiet moment. These scribes weren't only recording history, they were preserving each other. Every line of text, every decorated letter, is a small act of resistance against erasure, against time, against being forgotten. Outside, the snow falls again, slow and heavy. The wind has died entirely now, leaving a silence so deep you can hear the faint hum of the women's song echoing through the beams. You leave quietly, stepping into the white night. Behind you, the light from the turf house flickers like a heartbeat, steady, alive, and you realize Iceland's history isn't written by men or women. It's written by whoever refuses to let silence win. You wake to the sound of wind, but it's not harsh this time. It's more like breathing, long and steady, slipping through the gaps in a turf wall. Inside the dim room, you see a man hunched over a desk made of driftwood. The desk looks ancient, salt-worn, maybe rescued from a wrecked ship years ago. He's alone, except for the flame trembling in a clay lamp beside him. It's the dead of winter, the kind of night that feels endless. Outside, snow stretches across the valley, smooth as vellum. Inside, there's only this. One scribe, one quill, one story fighting the cold. You watch as he dips his quill into ink that's thickened overnight, murmuring something about the fire's laziness. He stirs the pot gently, coaxing the ink back to life. There's no rush. Icelandic scribes learned early that the land doesn't reward hurry. The wind still has its own schedule, the light its own mind. This one works at what you might call a driftwood desk, a table so narrow it's more suggestion than furniture. The chair creaks when he moves. The only heat comes from a small peat fire that sighs every time the wind sneaks through the door. He keeps his hands close to the flame, the skin cracked, knuckles blackened from ink. You can almost feel it. The cold pressing against his back, the faint burn of smoke in his lungs, the ache in his fingers that have already written a lifetime's worth of letters. And yet, there's peace here. He writes slowly, letting each word find its place. You notice his breathing, steady, rhythmic, matching the pace of his pen. You can hear the soft scritch. Pause. Scritch of the quill. A sound as constant as a heartbeat. Every few lines he glances toward the door, as if expecting someone. Maybe the messenger who'll carry this manuscript to another farm. Or maybe no one at all. Maybe it's just habit. To look up. To remind himself that the world still exists beyond ink and firelight. Historians still argue whether scribes like him worked entirely alone, or shared their nights with family or apprentices. In Iceland, space was too precious for solitude, yet some manuscripts, especially the smaller ones, bear signs of single hands, single moods, margins tight, lines unbroken, even the spelling uniquely personal. Maybe isolation was their secret luxury. You watch him pause mid-sentence. He blows on the ink, waiting for it to dry. The candle flickers, and his shadow stretches long across the wall. Giant and ghostly, He whispers a line aloud, testing its rhythm. It's not scripture this time. It's a saga, a story of a farmer, a feud, a snowfall. The details are local, domestic, almost trivial. But the tone? Epic. But even a cow getting loose becomes an event worth writing down. That's the Icelandic way. Treat every life as worth remembering. A quirky fact. Some surviving sagas include marginal notes describing weather conditions. Little remarks like snow fell heavy today, or the ink froze twice. Modern scholars use those notes to study medieval climate patterns. You imagine this man grinning wryly as he writes one down. Not for science, but simply to keep himself company. He stands for a moment, rubbing his shoulders. The fire's low again. He feeds it a handful of dried sheep dung. Yes, that's the fuel. And the flames leap, painting the walls gold. The light catches the edge of the vellum, making it glow almost alive. You realize that in a way, it is alive. Made from living skin, written by living hands, preserving living words. The scribe takes a sip from a mug of something murky, probably ale gone warm, and sighs contentedly. His eyes look tired but proud. You can tell he's been working on this saga for months, maybe years. He adjusts his candle, its base made from a sheep's rib, and returns to the page. The quill moves slower now, but with purpose. You feel a quiet awe. This man, alone in the frozen dark, believing so fiercely that stories matter. Historians still debate whether Iceland's isolation strengthened or limited its literary culture. On one hand, it kept the writing uniquely local, untainted by continental politics. On the other, it meant that every scribe worked with what little material they had. Ink, vellum, time. But maybe that's what gave their work its heartbeat. You walk around the small room, noticing details. A carved wooden cross above the door, a half-finished knife handle on the floor, a bundle of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The smell of sage and smoke fills the air. On the wall hangs a scrap of parchment with half a line written in a delicate hand, not his. Maybe a wife, a daughter, another quiet scribe who wrote between chores. The words fade midway through, as if time itself had run out. He pauses again, smiling faintly. Still there, he murmurs to no one in particular. Still holding. Maybe he means the ink, maybe the world. The quill scratches on. Outside, the storm begins again, soft flakes piling against the door. The roof creaks, the wind hums through the chimney. You find yourself matching his rhythm, breathing with him. The world shrinking to that single flicker of light. A funny thought crosses your mind. If anyone else were here, they'd call this boring. But you realize boredom, in its truest form, is a kind of peace. The scribe would agree. Let the world roar, he'd say. I'll keep my silence here. He dips his quill one last time, finishing the sentence with a flourish. Then, almost reverently, he places a small pebble on the edge of the parchment to keep it from curling overnight. It's an ordinary act, but it feels like a blessing. Finally, he leans back, closes his eyes, and whispers the story aloud one last time before sleep. The words drift into the air, mixing with the smoke, rising toward the rafters like prayers. You step outside. The snow has stopped. The valley glows under the moon, blue and endless. From the chimney, a thin thread of smoke curls upward. Somewhere inside that tiny house, a story sleeps on parchment, safe for now. And for the first time, you understand. Writing here isn't just art. It's warmth. It's shelter. It's how Iceland kept its heart beating through the dark. The morning comes gray and wet, a soft mist curling through the valley. You hear the rhythmic clang of hammers from somewhere near the chieftain's hall. A long house, larger and finer than any you've seen yet. The smell of roasted lamb mixes with smoke and damp wool. And there, amid all the bustle, you realize something subtle but profound. Words here are no longer just for faith or family. They've become political. Inside, the hall is dim but warm. A great hearth crackles in the center, its smoke drifting lazily toward a hole in the roof. Men sit along the benches, wrapped in cloaks, whispering and chuckling. A scribe sits at the far end, near a carved chair where the local Godi, the chieftain, presides. You can tell instantly that the scribe's presence isn't casual. His ink now carries weight. He's writing at the chieftain's command, copying a genealogy that stretches back to gods, heroes, and perhaps a bit of imagination. You hear him murmur the names as he writes. Eagle, son of Skallagrimr, son of Kveltoril, who came from Norway, descended from gods. The chieftain nods, approvingly. A few guests exchange knowing glances. You can almost feel the politics beneath the parchment. In medieval Iceland, lineage wasn't just family pride. It was legitimacy, the invisible armor that kept power intact. Historians still argue whether the sagas were purely historical records or political tools. Some suggest the great families, the Sturlungs, the Odaverjar, commissioned sagas to glorify their ancestors. Others think scribes simply wrote what they knew. Maybe both are true. What's certain is that every inked line changed how people remembered themselves. You walk closer to the scribe. His quill moves slower here, more careful, as if each word might anger a ghost. He scratches a small note in the margin. Something about truth unclear. You smile. Even then, footnotes existed, quietly doubting everything. The chieftain leans forward. Good. Write that my forefather fought beside King Harold, he says. The scribe hesitates just long enough to make it awkward. Are you sure? He asks gently. The chieftain raises an eyebrow. Quite sure. The quill resumes its work. A soft chuckle ripples through the hall. The power dynamic is clear. The chieftain owns the ink, but the scribe owns the words. A delicate balance, one might say. The political version of walking on frozen lakes. You glance around the hall. Tapestries hang along the walls, depicting longboats, feasts, and hunting scenes. Beneath them, children play quietly with carved bone animals. Near the hearth, an old woman mends a cloak, listening as the men argue about old alliances. She shakes her head at one name. That one was no hero, she mutters, just loud. You hide a grin. Revisionist history, Icelandic style. The scribe dips his pen again, his expression calm but knowing. You can tell he's edited a dozen genealogies like this one. Sometimes you suspect the ink itself becomes a kind of negotiation, a peace treaty between pride and reality. A quirky fact. One 13th century Icelandic manuscript, Hawksbók, compiled by Hákon Erlendsson, includes not only history and law, but also the family tree of its author, written 3 times, each version slightly more flattering than the last. Historians today laugh about it, but it shows how fluid truth was when ink met power. You settle beside the fire, watching the play of light on the parchment. The scribe's hand trembles slightly, maybe from age, maybe from the pressure of getting it right, or right enough. Outside, rain begins to patter softly on the turf roof. Inside, the murmur of voices continues, like the low hum of bees. Then, something unexpected happens. The chieftain, perhaps feeling magnanimous, asks the scribe to read aloud what's been written so far. The man clears his throat and begins. His voice is calm, measured, confident. You realize he's not just reading words. He's performing power. The names roll like thunder through the hall, each one a reminder of who owns the land, the sheep, the feasts. But when he finishes, the silence is heavy. The chieftain nods slowly, satisfied, then claps his hands. "Good," he says. "Add that my forefathers built bridges where others built walls." You catch the faintest flicker of irony in the scribe's eyes as he writes the line down anyway. Historians still debate whether Iceland's transition from oral storytelling to written history marked a loss of truth or its preservation. But here, in this hall, you can see how both can be true. The moment something is written, it hardens, but it also endures. Later that night, when the feast begins, the scribe remains near the hearth. He doesn't drink much. Instead, he writes small notes on scraps of vellum, maybe reminders for tomorrow's work. One slip of parchment catches your eye. It reads, "Even kings forget what was never written." You wonder if the chieftain knows his scribe's quiet wit. Probably not. As the hall fills with laughter and the smell of roasted meat, the scribe finally sets his quill aside. He looks tired but content. He's earned his keep today, not just in coin or food, but in a subtler way. His words have shaped the memory of his people, their pride, their story. You step outside into the rain. It's warm for Iceland, the kind of drizzle that clings to your eyelashes. The torches flicker in the wind. Behind you, the hall glows golden through the mist, a beacon of noise and ink and ego. You think about how fragile it all is. The power, the parchments, even the stories themselves. Yet somehow, these words, born in smoky halls, will survive volcanic eruptions, famines, reformations. They'll outlive everyone inside. And in that thought, there's something strangely comforting. The scribes may serve power tonight, but history, in the end, serves them. You turn to leave, the rain pattering softly on your cloak, and the faint echo of the scribe's voice follows you out into the fog, still whispering names that refuse to die. The rain that soaked you last night has frozen by morning. The air now rings faintly when you breathe, and your boots squeak against a thin crust of frost. Somewhere ahead you hear chanting, low, melodic and distinctly foreign. You follow it toward a small wooden church crouched on a windswept ridge. The door creaks when you push it open. Inside, the air smells of beeswax and salt. The light from narrow windows glows gold against dark timber. And there, standing before a rough-hewn altar, is a priest. His robe patched, his hair silver. He's reading from a book written in Latin. But beside him lies a tablet carved with runes. For a moment, the two worlds sit side by side. The old faith and the new, the carved and the inked, the whispered and the chanted. This, you realize, is the strange crossroads where Icelandic scribes once stood, halfway between Odin and the Holy Spirit, between the carved rune and the written word. You approach quietly. The priest looks up, smiles faintly, and gestures for you to come closer. "We keep both," he says softly, nodding at the rune stick and the manuscript. One for the soul, one for the memory. On the table, you see a piece of driftwood inscribed with runes, shallow grooves, rough but deliberate. Next to it lies a vellum page covered in careful black Latin script. They look like they belong to different centuries, yet here they are, sharing the same light. Historians still argue how long runes survived after Christianity, came to Iceland around the year .dal. Officially, Latin letters replaced them quickly. Unofficially, runes lived on for centuries, carved into doors, tools, and even the occasional secret love note. Some scholars believe that rural farmers continued to use them for practical magic well into the 18th century. The priest turns the vellum toward you. It's a psalter, a book of hymns and prayers. The handwriting is small, but confident. "Written by my cousin," he says, "but I still carve when my hands tire." You notice the runic stick nearby bears a small inscription. Remember warmth when the fire burns low. You can't help smiling. Practical advice disguised as poetry. Outside, the wind sighs through the door like an old ghost. The priest takes a seat on a rough stool and begins sharpening his quill. "We once prayed to Thor for good weather," he says quietly. "Now we pray to Saint Olaf. Either way, the storms still come." There's no bitterness in his tone, just resignation. Change in Iceland happens slowly, and usually with a shrug. You walk around the small church. The walls are lined with tiny inscriptions, half Latin, half rune-like scratches. Maybe graffiti left by bored parishioners, maybe prayers, maybe both. One, faint and crooked, reads, "Let my words not freeze." You think of the scribe from the earlier nights, alone with his inkpot, whispering to the fire. Some prayers never change. A young boy enters, carrying a small box. Inside are scraps of parchment, each one with notes written in both scripts, Latin letters and younger runes. The priest takes one, studies it, and smiles. He learns both, he says proudly, just in case one stops working. It's not a joke exactly, but everyone laughs anyway. That dry Icelandic humor again. The kind that makes even theology sound practical. Historians still debate whether early Icelandic Christianity suppressed or preserved the pagan stories. In truth, it probably did both. Some clerics destroyed old manuscripts, while others quietly copied them under the guise of cultural record. Without those half-secret scribes, the Norse myths might have vanished completely. So when you read the prose Edda, or the poetic Edda, you're reading something born in a church, written by men who believed in Christ, but still respected the gods of their grandfathers. The priest begins chanting again, but softer this time. The sound blends Latin syllables with the rolling vowels of Old Norse. It's hauntingly beautiful, like hearing two worlds overlap for one last time before parting ways. You sit near the hearth, the warmth gentle against your face. A small crucifix hangs above the fire, carved from whalebone. Next to it, on a shelf, rests a stone carved with a rune that means home. You can't help but wonder if the priest knows, or if he simply likes the shape. He finishes his chant and lowers his head in silence. Then he says, "Words matter more than faith, I think. Without them, we forget how to believe at all." You nod. It's the sort of statement that could get him in trouble, but in this frozen corner of the world, no one's listening but the wind. A quirky tidbit. Icelanders never entirely abandoned runes. Even after printing presses arrived in the 16th century, rune calendars, primstafar, were still used to mark holy days and planting seasons. They looked like little wooden rulers carved with cryptic marks, half tool, half relic. Every farm had one. The priest stands, places a hand on the rune stick, and says softly, "Old gods never vanish. They just wait quietly in the margins." You think of the manuscripts you've seen. The doodles, the hidden notes, the small drawings of Thor's hammer tucked beside Latin prayers. The truth of Iceland is written there. Contradiction is comfort. Outside, the snow begins again. Slow and silent. The priest walks you to the door and looks out across the white fields. "Do you hear it?" he asks. At first you think he means the wind, but then you realize it's the faint scratching of quills echoing from farmhouses in the distance. The whole island writing itself into existence. As you leave, you glance back at the church. Through the doorway, you can still see the glint of the rune stick and the flicker of candlelight reflected on ink. It's hard to tell which glows brighter. Somewhere in that tension, between faith and myth, between carving and writing, Iceland found its voice. Not one language, but two, humming in harmony through the long dark. The air smells faintly of iron and seaweed, and the low winter sun lies weak across the snow. You're back inside another writing room, but this one is livelier, less sacred, more mischievous. The walls are plastered with discarded scraps of parchment, each with half-finished words, crooked letters, or doodles. Someone has drawn a smiling sheep in the corner, its wool shaped like a cloud. Another page reads, "My hand aches. Send more ink." You've found yourself among Iceland's tired but very human scribes, the ones who kept their humor hidden in the margins. The room hums with quiet chaos. Two men sit at a long table, their cloaks thrown over chairs, while a third stands, squinting at a page under the window's pale light. He mutters something unrepeatable about his ink consistency. On the hearth, a kettle hisses lazily. You recognize the rhythm by now. Dip, scratch, curse, pause, repeat. One of the men looks up and grins when he sees you. "You're just in time," he says, gesturing toward a sheet. "Our saint here spilled ink on half a song. We're calling it divine intervention." The other groans. "Or clumsy hands," he replies. Laughter fills the room. It's the dry, weary kind. The laughter of people who have been awake too long, writing too small for too little pay. You step closer to the table. The page in front of them is covered with careful black script, perfectly aligned, until suddenly, near the bottom, there's a doodle. A small, lopsided man with a halo, holding what looks suspiciously like a beer mug. Below it, a note. "Blessed are those who copy straight." Historians still argue whether these doodles were acts of rebellion or simply boredom. Some say they reflect a scribe's private voice, breaking through the monotony of copying scripture. Others think they were tests of the quill, like vocal warm-ups, but for hands. Either way, they give the manuscripts personality. Icelandic scribes weren't machines. They were tired, funny, sometimes grumpy people who still found room to joke with eternity. The third man sighs and blows on his ink. "It's too thick again," he mutters. "It freezes faster than my patience." Without missing a beat, another replies, "That's not hard." You stifle a laugh. In the corner, you notice a stack of older pages. Some damaged, some unfinished. One bears faint traces of a poem, scratched out and replaced with a prayer. Beneath the Latin text, if you tilt it toward the light, you can still see the ghost of the erased words. A verse about the northern lights. It ends mid-line. The sky cracks open, and then it fades. Historians still debate whether this layering of texts, holy over mundane, sacred over poetic, was deliberate censorship or simple thrift. Icelanders reused vellum constantly. Skin was precious, after all. But part of you wonders if they understood the irony. That, under every sermon, a poem. A younger scribe, maybe an apprentice, leans over his own sheet. His letters wobble slightly, uneven but eager. You recognize the look in his eyes. Pride mixed with exhaustion. He writes a single line in the margin when he thinks no one's watching. I wish I were at sea. Maybe he means it. Maybe it's a joke. Either way, it survives, even now. A quirky fact. In one Icelandic manuscript, a scribe complained that his lamp kept smoking too much and blamed the devil in the oil. Another wrote, the weather is cold, the ink freezes, and my teeth chatter. These little notes, tucked between sagas and psalms, are what scholars call colophons, signatures of fatigue and humanity. You can almost hear their sighs echoing across centuries. The older man at the window suddenly laughs. Look here, he says, pointing at his page. A snail. You blink. Sure enough, he's drawn a small snail climbing up the side of a Latin paragraph, its shell shaped like a perfect spiral. He's racing toward salvation, the man says solemnly, and the room erupts again in laughter. The joy is infectious, but beneath it lies something quieter. A shared understanding that even in monotony, there's meaning. Every line copied, every doodle drawn, is another day the words survive. You notice the oldest scribe in the group, the one with trembling hands and ink-stained sleeves. He hasn't laughed once, but when you glance at his page, you see he's been drawing tiny crosses in the margins, each one perfect. Maybe it's prayer. Maybe it's muscle memory. Maybe both. The kettle whistles, and someone pours tea, or maybe weak ale, into rough wooden cups. The warmth seeps into your fingers as you hold one. You feel the fatigue of the room settle into something comfortable, almost familial. There's no grandeur here. No grand abbey with marble floors. Just wood, smoke, and the scratch of human persistence. Historians still argue about how collaborative these manuscripts really were. Did multiple hands work on one saga? Or was each book the solitary product of one stubborn scribe? The truth seems to lie somewhere in this room. They argue. They laugh. They share ink and curses. But each page still bears an individual pulse. The young apprentice breaks the quiet. Do you think anyone will read this in 100 years? He asks. The room falls silent. The oldest scribe looks up, eyes shining in the firelight. No, he says softly, but it will have existed. That's enough. You sit with that thought as the night deepens. The laughter fades, replaced by the familiar rhythm of quills and breath. The snail climbs toward salvation. The ink stains another sleeve. Outside, the northern lights ripple faintly across the sky, green silk unrolling over the black horizon. The scribes don't notice, but you do. Maybe that's how history works here. Quietly, unnoticed, ink freezing and thawing, laughter echoing between lines no one will ever read aloud again. You look once more at the doodles, the sheep, the snail, the crooked halo, and realize that Iceland's manuscripts aren't cold relics. They're worn with fingerprints and jokes, with humanity still smudged into every page. And in that warmth, you can almost hear the scribes whispering still. Write straight, keep laughing, and for heaven's sake, warm the ink. You wake to the muffled sound of sheep outside, the bleating echoing faintly through turf walls. The room smells of hay, wool, and something faintly metallic, the scent of drying ink. A thin beam of light filters in through a window of scraped cow horn, turning the air to gold dust. You're inside one of the manuscript houses now, those rare Icelandic farmsteads that doubled as literary workshops. It's smaller than you imagined. The ceiling is low enough that you'd hit your head if you forgot to stoop. But inside, it's alive. A woman hums as she turns pages. A boy sharpens quills with a knife that looks too big for his hands. Two older men argue softly over spelling. Their voices the tone of wind through reeds. You realize this isn't just a room. It's an ecosystem, a place where words breed like sheep. On the long central table, you see piles of parchment, some bound loosely with string, others stacked by size. Each bears a different hand. No single person owns this work. It belongs to the family, the generations, the land itself. Historians still argue whether these manuscript houses were common or rare, but we know of a few famous ones, like Morroveli, Adi, and Skar. Some were tied to monasteries, others purely domestic, but in each, the idea was the same. Knowledge wasn't a luxury for the clergy alone. In Iceland, even farmers copied books between feeding animals and fixing roofs. You step closer to one of the men, his face lined with decades of squinting. He's reading aloud from a saga while another writes. The rhythm between them is mesmerizing, voice and ink, breath and motion. It's the old oral tradition, now with a quill attached. Every sentence is checked, questioned, adjusted. Sometimes they argue for 10 minutes over a single phrase. The argument ends with a smile. Let it stay, the older one says. That's how my grandmother told it. The other nods and keeps writing. You realize that these manuscripts weren't just copies. They were collaborations between memory and ink, between old and young, between the living and the remembered. A quirky fact. In some surviving Icelandic manuscripts, historians have identified the handwriting of up to 4 different family members on a single text. A father begins it, a son finishes, a daughter corrects, a grandson adds a note in the margin 50 years later. A saga that took centuries to write, and it still feels like a single breath. The boy sharpening quills catches your eye. You can tell who wrote which page, he says proudly. My uncle makes his R like a fishhook. He demonstrates, tracing the curve in the air. You can't help smiling. His hands are ink-stained, his hair sticking up from sleep. He's the next link in the chain, already learning the rhythms of patience. One of the women, gray-haired, kind eyes, hands you a page to hold. The vellum feels smooth, but strong, faintly warm from the fire. The ink glistens. It's part of Laxdæla Saga, the story of love and revenge that every Icelander seems to know by heart. The words look delicate, but you know they've survived volcanoes, storms, and centuries of neglect. You wonder if these writers ever imagined their pages would one day sit behind glass, read by people continents away. Probably not. They were writing for the future they could see. Their children, their parish, their neighbors. The family pauses for lunch. Bread, cheese, dried fish. They eat quietly, the conversation meandering from whether to sheep births to whether a certain chieftain in the saga really would have said that. Even in mealtime chatter, stories are currency. One of the men jokes that if he dies mid-sentence, they should make sure his ghost gets proper grammar credit. Laughter fills the room. Historians still debate how much editing Icelandic sagas underwent across generations. The evidence suggests a blend of continuity and evolution. The core remained, but the telling softened with each hand. You can see that process right now. A daughter reading aloud hesitates at one violent scene, frowns, and quietly changes a word. Stabbed becomes struck. A small mercy inserted mid-century. Afternoon stretches long and gray. The air smells of smoke and ink. Someone reads a psalm while another copies it in the background. The two voices twining gently. Every sound here feels sacred. Not religious exactly, but reverent toward survival. Icelandic culture has always blurred the line between work and worship, and this house embodies it. In the corner, a chest sits half open. Inside are folded manuscripts, their edges darkened with age. A small note written on a scrap of birch bark lies atop them. To be read again when we forget. The words stop you. You trace them lightly, half expecting the bark to crumble. That phrase, when we forget, feels like the mission statement of all the scribes you've met. They weren't chasing fame. They were fighting forgetfulness itself. The younger man who had argued earlier sighs, stretching his arms. "How many pages left?" he asks. "Enough," comes the answer. He laughs. Always enough. The fire crackles, and the wind howls softly through the turf walls, agreeing. A quirky discovery from modern researchers. Some Icelandic manuscripts contain embedded fingerprints, literally the smudged impressions of those who wrote or bound them. When scientists scanned them under UV light, they found prints belonging to men, women, even children. Tiny traces of inked thumbs pressed into eternity. You glance at the boy again, his small hands already marked. He's leaving his print too. As dusk creeps in, the family gathers their work into neat piles. The oldest man stacks them carefully in a wooden chest lined with wool. He ties it shut with a strip of leather and murmurs, "Sleep well, little stories." Then, satisfied, he blows out the candles. The last glow fades, leaving only the sound of breathing, the faint sigh of parchment settling. You step outside into the twilight, the air crisp and clear. The northern lights ripple faintly above, green and silver, like invisible ink across the sky. Behind you, in that small house of words, centuries of voices rest quietly. You can almost hear them whisper through the cracks of the door. We wrote, therefore we remain. The morning dawns quieter than usual, the kind of pale, thin light that feels almost apologetic. You step out of the sleeping farmhouse, expecting the same old sounds. The wind, the sheep, the creak of wood. But something's different. The valley feels softer, muted. It takes you a moment to realize what's missing. The scraping of hides, the stretching, the scraping, the smell of lime water, all gone. You follow a faint trail of footprints down to the next settlement, where you find a few men gathered outside a shed. They're laughing, holding something thin, white, and strange between their hands. It looks like parchment at first, but when you touch it, it's different, smoother, lighter. Nog hold and mande. Paper, dar. You can hardly believe it, and neither can they. Imported from the continent. Cheap, stackable, easier to fold. It flutters in the slightest breeze, almost absurdly delicate compared to the thick vellum of the old days. One of the men tosses a sheet into the air, watching it drift down like a snowflake. He laughs. No sheep required. The arrival of paper changed everything. It's hard to imagine now, but in Iceland, it must have felt like a small miracle. For centuries, stories cost livestock. Whole flocks were sacrificed to the making of a single book. Now, suddenly, words are almost affordable. Inside the shed, a young scribe is experimenting. He dips his quill into a thinner ink, hesitates, then writes a line. The paper drinks it greedily. The ink spreads a little too fast. He frowns, blows on it, and smiles anyway. She'll need lighter hands, he mutters. Historians still argue when paper first appeared in Iceland. Some say the late 14th century. Others claim small batches arrived earlier via trade from Norway. Either way, the change was seismic. Within a generation, parchment began to fade. You wander deeper into the shed. Sheets of paper hang from strings to dry, fluttering in the draft like pale fish skins. The smell is different. Less animal, more wood and smoke. It feels modern, though you know that word won't exist for centuries. Strange stuff, isn't it? Says a voice behind you. An older man, clearly a veteran of the vellum days, watches with folded arms. Too soft, too thin. It tears if you sneeze near it. He chuckles, but there's sadness in his eyes. But it writes faster, and time's always short. That last line hangs in the air, heavy. You realize what he means. Paper speeds things up. What once took months can now be done in days. The rhythm of writing, the slow scrape, the measured pace will change. The art of waiting for ink to dry, of warming hands before each line, might vanish. A quirky fact. One of Iceland's earliest paper manuscripts, AM 732b, contains doodles comparing vellum and paper. A scribe drew a sheep on one page and a tree on the other, labeling them the old way and the new. You can imagine the quiet humor in that. The passing of an era marked by a doodle. You watch the young scribe stack his new sheets, his fingers trembling a little from excitement. "I'll write 3 sagas this winter," he says proudly. The older man snorts. "You'll write 3 drafts of one and tear the rest." They both laugh, and you can feel the warmth between generations. The torch quietly passing hands. Historians still debate whether the arrival of paper democratized Icelandic writing or diluted its craftsmanship. The truth is probably both. More people could write, yes, but fewer had to labor for years to make each page perfect. The manuscripts would multiply, but perhaps lose a bit of their soul. You move to the corner where an old vellum book sits open on a stool. Its pages are thick, yellowed, and deeply textured, like holding history itself. Beside it lies a new paper book, bright and flat. You touch both at once, and it's like feeling the pulse of 2 centuries overlapping. One rough, enduring. The other light, quick, full of possibility. Outside, the wind rises. The hanging sheets of paper flutter like birds trying to take flight. The young scribe rushes to grab them, laughing. "They have wings," he says. The old man shakes his head, smiling softly. "Aye, let's hope they fly far." By evening, the valley smells faintly of wood pulp and peat. The scribes sit by the hearth, testing their new material, adapting old habits to new textures. You can see the wonder in their faces, but also a shadow of nostalgia. The parchment age is ending. Soon, no one will scrape hides or grind bones for ink. The new age of writing will be faster, thinner, more fragile. And yet, as you watch the boy's quill glide across paper with the ease of a dancer, you realize something profound. Speed doesn't always mean loss. It means reach. These pages, cheaper and lighter, can travel farther than any vellum codex ever could. Iceland's words, once trapped in valleys and farmhouses, will soon cross oceans. A curious irony. Though parchment has long since vanished, the words it carried survive best. Paper yellows, burns, crumbles, but those old skin pages endure. And yet, without paper, many later, sagas would never have been written at all. History always bargains that way, gain and loss sharing the same breath. The older man closes the last vellum book with a sigh. "The sheep can rest now," he says, "but I'll miss the sound of scraping." The boy grins. "We'll find new sounds." Outside, the aurora flickers faintly through thin cloud, a ghostly shimmer of green and violet. The light dances on the drying sheets, making them glow. For a moment, the whole valley looks like it's filled with floating stories, mid-breath, waiting to be read. And just like that, Iceland steps quietly into its next chapter. Not with a revolution, but with the rustle of paper and a sigh of wind. The snow outside lies unbroken, a white silence that feels almost too large. The wind that once carried the smell of ink and lime water now only brings a faint whisper of wood smoke. The great age of the scribes, the one you've wandered through for so long, is nearing its twilight. You find yourself walking toward a small town by the coast. The sea glitters under a low sun, and somewhere in the distance, you hear a new sound. Steady, mechanical, almost percussive. It's not the scratch of a quill. It's something harder, sharper. When you enter the building, the air feels warmer than it should. The smell of oil and iron replaces that of vellum and soot. A man in a heavy apron bends over a strange contraption made of levers and plates. You watch, fascinated, as he inks a raised block, lowers the press, and then lifts a sheet. The words appear instantly. Perfect. Duplicated. You've just witnessed what must feel like magic. Iceland's first encounter with the printing press. The man wipes his brow and grins when he sees your expression. Faster than a scribe, eh? He says, but not nearly as poetic. He's right. The beauty of it is undeniable. The speed, the precision. But you can't help missing the human rhythm of pen on skin, of sighs between lines. The printed page looks immaculate, almost too perfect, as if it's forgotten how to breathe. Historians still argue when Iceland's scribal culture truly ended. Some say the mid-16th century, when Bishop Jan Arason imported a printing press to Haller and began mass-producing prayer books. Others say it ended more slowly, page by page, as scribes realized that their ink-stained fingers had no place in the new age. You step closer to the press. The operator gestures toward a shelf stacked with identical books. Each one looks like the next, the letters uniform, the margins clean. There's no crooked line, no tired doodle, no wry note about freezing ink, just order. It's beautiful in its way, but also cold. You think of the old scribes, their cramped hands, their crooked oars, their laughter in smoky rooms, and you wonder what they'd think of this. Nearby, an elderly man sits at a desk, copying something by hand. You recognize him instantly, a relic of the old craft, refusing to surrender. He dips his quill carefully and keeps writing, ignoring the clatter of the press. His letters are uneven but graceful. He pauses occasionally to blow on the ink, the same way his grandfather did. The printer calls over, half joking, "You'll never keep up with me, old one." The man smiles without looking up. "Perhaps not," he says softly, "but my words will still smell of breath." That quiet answer hangs in the air. The printer hesitates, then laughs, but you can hear a trace of respect in it. The shift from scribe to print wasn't violent. It was weary, inevitable, and oddly gentle. There was no rebellion, no bonfire of quills. The old scribes simply faded. They finished their last pages, closed their ink pots, and handed their craft to the machine. Some even helped design the first typefaces, shaping the metal letters after their own handwriting. In a way, their touch lived on, a quirky historical detail. The earliest Icelandic printed books used typefaces modeled on Gothic script, the same angular, spidery letters used by the scribes. To the casual reader, printed pages looked handwritten. Maybe that was deliberate, a way to soften the shock of progress, change disguised as continuity. You stand between the two men, the printer and the scribe, and realize this is history folding in on itself. One chapter, closing, while another opens, neither quite letting go of the other. Outside, the sound of waves mingles with the rhythmic thunk of the press. The smell of ink lingers, but it's different now. Sharper, metallic, mass-produced. No more ale or soot. No more freezing pots. Historians still debate whether printing helped preserve Iceland's literary soul or diluted it. Without it, many sagas would have vanished. With it, their individuality blurred. Maybe that's the trade every age makes with progress. The cost of immortality is uniformity. You walk outside, the sea wind biting your face. A group of children play nearby, holding thin paper books in their mittened hands. One recites a line aloud, proud and loud, a passage from Njal's saga. You smile. The voice carries, strong against the wind. The story endures. Back inside, the old scribe finally stands, rubbing his hands. He looks at the printed books and nods, almost fondly. Let them have their speed, he says. We had our silence. Then he places his last handwritten page on the table, a neat copy of a psalm, and walks out, leaving his quill beside the press like a relic at an altar. The printer picks it up, studies it, and sets it gently on a shelf. He doesn't say anything. You can tell he knows what it represents. A faint snow begins to fall, drifting through the open doorway. You step outside and watch it settle on the roofs of the town, on the ships in the harbor, on the hills beyond. The same snow that once fell on the vellum makers, on the storytellers, on the laughing scribes in smoky rooms. The snow doesn't care what it lands on. Vellum, paper, or metal. It just keeps falling. Oh, and maybe that's the quiet truth. The scribe's world didn't really end. It just changed shape, like snow melting into ink pressed into type. Type returned to silence. You walk back through the cold air, and the wind carries faint echoes of quills, scratching somewhere beyond memory. Maybe it's imagination, or maybe it's history breathing through you one last time. You return to the valley where it all began, though it's changed in ways both vast and invisible. The turf houses are empty now, their roofs caved in under snow. Grass grows where quills once scratched, and the faint sound of wind through broken chimneys replaces the old hum of human voices. Yet somehow, you can still feel them. The scribes, the storytellers, the women at their tables, the boys sharpening quills. Their ghosts live quietly in the air. In the ink-dark soil beneath your boots, you walk slowly through the ruins of a farmhouse. Inside, you find a stone hearth, half collapsed, and beside it, something astonishing. A fragment of parchment wedged under a rock. It's brittle, yellowed, the ink faded to a soft brown. You brush off the dirt and hold it to the light. The words are barely legible, but you make out a line you've seen before. We wrote so we would not vanish. It's impossible to tell who wrote it, or when. Maybe it was one of the scribes you met. Maybe it was a later hand, writing in homage. It doesn't matter. The sentiment is universal. And in that moment, you feel the entire history of Icelandic writing. Its rise, its patience, its quiet fading, collapse into a single heartbeat. You wander outside again. The valley stretches under a gray sky, the same sky they all saw, the same wind they all endured. It feels timeless here, like the landscape itself refuses to age. The hills still cradle the memory of long nights spent in flickering light, the smell of peat and ink, the soft laughter of those who believed that words could outlast cold. Historians still argue how many manuscripts were lost. Some burned, others forgotten. Many simply decayed, yet over 700 still survive today, housed in climate-controlled archives, their pages whispering faintly when turned. The hands that made them are long gone, but their fingerprints, literally, in some cases, remain pressed into the parchment. Tiny, perfect, human. You imagine one of those archivists now, centuries later, in a glass-walled reading room in Reykjavik. She wears gloves, leans over a fragile codex, and breathes the same way the old scribes once did. Carefully, reverently, she adjusts the page, studies the faint pen strokes, and for a brief second, she bridges 1,000 years of silence. The lineage continues. A quirky note you can't help but love. Sometimes, under ultraviolet light, the old pages glow faintly blue, revealing the erased words beneath the text. Hidden jokes, practice lines, faint outlines of doodles. The manuscripts are alive, palimpsests of thought, memory, and mischief. You sit on a cold rock near the ruins and close your eyes. The wind hums low, steady, almost musical. It sounds like a quill scratching on vellum. You picture the boy from the manuscript house, now grown, writing his last page before the printing presses arrived. You see the women in the turflit scriptorium, the old priest holding his runestick, the scribe muttering about freezing ink. They're all still here, somewhere in the folds of time, their words circling the island like migrating birds that never quite leave. You open your eyes again. Snow begins to fall, slow and deliberate, flakes spinning in the gray air. You think of how the old scribes used to describe it. White silence, they called it. A kind of peace. The valley fills with that peace now, settling softly over the remnants of what they built. The last of the snow drifts through the window of the ruined house, landing on the parchment fragment still lying in your hand. For a heartbeat, the ink darkens, as if waking from a long sleep. Then it fades again. You smile. Some stories only breathe when reminded they're still loved. Historians still debate whether the decline of the scribes marked an ending or a transformation. But standing here, you know better. The quiet rise and slow decline of Icelandic scribes isn't a sad story. It's a story about endurance. About people who, in a land of storms and stone, decided that memory itself was worth laboring for. You look toward the horizon, where the sea glimmers faintly through the mist. A raven flies overhead, black wings cutting through white sky. You half expect it to speak, to deliver one last message from the past. It doesn't, but in its silence you hear everything you've learned. The wind shifts once more, carrying faint echoes, the laughter of women copying psalms, the sigh of ink freezing, the scratch of quills under candlelight. They're whispers now, but they're enough. You exhale slowly, the breath mingling with the cold air, and whisper back. You're remembered. The valley listens, then folds itself into stillness. Now the pace slows, and you feel your breathing settle. The cold of Iceland fades, the snow becomes softer, the sky lighter, almost translucent. The valley sounds, the faint wind, the imagined scratching of quills, drift away like smoke. You imagine lying down in one of those old turf houses, the warmth of the peat fire still glowing faintly. The air smells of ink and wool. Outside, snow falls in steady rhythm, the same rhythm that guided every scribe's hand. You listen. No. There it is again. That ancient cadence. Breath, ink, word, silence. The fire crackles quietly. In your mind, you can see the last of the manuscripts resting on a wooden table, its pages gently rising with each shift of air. The words seem to glow faintly, as if remembering their own creation. You let your mind drift further now. The scribes fade, the houses fade, the mountains dissolve into mist. What remains is the rhythm of their work, the belief that even the smallest act of remembrance matters. You realize that every story you've ever heard, every name ever written, carries a trace of that same devotion. The wind outside softens to a whisper, and you feel your eyelids grow heavy. Somewhere far away, a raven cries once, and then falls silent. The last of the light fades. The world grows still. And you understand, though the ink has long dried, the story never truly ends. It simply sleeps, waiting for another quiet night to be read aloud. You breathe in slowly, exhale, and let the darkness wrap around you. Sleep well, traveler. The scribes will keep writing, quietly, eternally, somewhere just beyond the edge of dreaming.